Well, hello, folks. Barry Landau here. You're watching a new episode of Barry Landau's Tropical Planet. I'm here today with my old friend, John Martinez, who is a longtime collector and grower of terrestrial bromeliads, such as Deutericonias and mainly Dyckias. How you doing, John?
I'm doing well, Barry. How about you?
Pretty good. It's funny. An old time bromeliad friend used to say, when I asked him how he was, he'd go, I'm still vertical. Anyways, uh, well, John, it's so great of you to come here today to talk to us. John's going to give us a presentation on his really nice, great collection of Dyckias, mostly Dyckias and some Deutericonia, that he's been growing for 15 or 20 years. And this is a presentation he's been making over the years to various cactus and succulent clubs as part of a kind of generous outreach program to promote these great plants, meaning the Dyckias, to a broader audience. Well, John, thanks for coming here today. And on that note, go ahead and if you can, see if you can share your screen and we'll see what we can do. Oh, fantastic. This is
Okay, let's see here.
so pleasant to have a guest who knows what he's doing with the computer. Oh, there it is. Fantastic.
Okay, you got that?
We got it, and I'm just gonna shut up and let you go.
Okay. See what? Well, Barry, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. This presentation, I'm calling it Dyckia and their allies, those other succulents. And like Barry said, the reason I put this together was to introduce the cactus and succulent folks to these amazing plants, these terrestrial bromeliads. So kind of the way this started about 15, 16 years ago, I was at a plant show in Los Angeles, and there was a vendor there that had had a booth there with all these amazing colorful bromeliads. And I walked around to the back of his booth and I saw this nursery flat about half full of these 4-inch pots with these small Dyckia plants in them. And I'm looking at these plants, and a friend of mine, Steve Ball, who some of you may know, came up to me, and I asked Steve, I said, Steve, do you know anything about these plants? And if you know Steve, you know pretty much what he said. He said, yeah, those are great plants. You should buy some. So I picked out 2 plants. One of them had a tag that just said Dyckia hybrid. And the second one had a tag on it that said Dyckia, and in parentheses had the word Irwin, which I later learned was this vendor's name of the street where he had his residential nursery. And that vendor's name was Bill Baker, who I didn't know at the time. So I grew these plants, and over the next couple of years, I picked up a couple more from mostly from club meetings. And during that time, my hobby of cactus and succulents mostly was taking over my backyard. My wife suggested that I do something about that. So I approached a couple friends, 3 friends, and suggested that we rent some property somewhere and create a cooperative growing compound. We all thought it was a great idea. So we rented some property and put in all the infrastructure, water lines and hoop houses and shade cloth and all that. And all of a sudden, I had all this room in the world to experiment with growing plants. So about the time we got all this completed, one of the partners was down in the San Diego area one morning, and he gives me a call. I'm out there we call it the ranch. And he says, hey, John, I've got this down here at this nursery, and this guy's going out of business, and he has this collection of all these terrestrial bromeliads. Are you interested? So, I asked him how much, and he quoted me a price. I asked him, is it worth it? And he said, I have no idea. And then, of course, the next question was, if I do this, can you get them all home in one trip? And he goes, yeah, I think so. So I pulled the trigger. And that afternoon, he showed up at the ranch with 9 flats of plants. And most of them I'd never heard of before or seen before. There were Dyckias and Deutericonias and orthophytums, hectea, just amazing array of plants. So what I'd like to do during this presentation today is share with you kind of my journey of trying to figure out what these plants were, how to keep them alive, how to propagate them, and eventually how to hybridize them. So here we go. I had a hard time finding any written documentation. So one of the first things I did once I received this collection was to join the local Bromeliad Society, the San Fernando Valley Bromeliad Society. And I just wanted to give a shout out to these three guys, Richard Kaz, Brian Chan, and Steve Ball. And just to say that these guys have been extremely generous with sharing information and encouraging me to grow the plants and to keep pursuing this interest I had in these terrestrial bromeliads. So my main focus today is going to be on Dyckias. So what are they? First of all, they're bromeliads. And these numbers are always changing, but generally there's about 58 genera, over 3,000 species. They're mostly confined to tropical and subtropical zones of the New World. They grow in mesic environments, xeric environments, and everything in between. They're terrestrial, epiphytic, which means they grow on rocks, and epiphytic, and they go from sea level to the extreme high elevations of the Andes Mountains. So within the family of Bromeliaceae, there are 8 subfamilies. Some of these you probably are familiar with, and some of them are a little bit not as common or well known. The Brachynoideae only has one genus, Brachynia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct or not. And I only mention that because that's an interesting plant, because it's one of the two genus of carnivorous plants. Of course, the Bromeliaceae are the Echmeas, the Bilbergias, the Neoroselias, plants that a lot of us are familiar with. And of course, the Ananas are the pineapples. And then we've got the Hectias, and some of the more commonly seen subfamilies would include the Tillandsia group. Catopsis is in the Tillandsioideae family, and that is also one of the carnivorous bromeliads. And of course, the Puyas, and then the subfamily that we're going to be talking about here is the Picarnioideae, which include 5 different genera. And those genera include the 2 mesic genera, which are Fusteriella and Picarnia. The 3 xeric genus are Deuterconia, Dyckia, and Encalarium. And I think that's where we're going to be spending most of our time here today. So it's very easy to confuse a lot of these terrestrial bromeliads with the Dyckias. We've got the Hectia, Deuterconia, and the Encalarium, and Puya are probably the most commonly plants that are confused with the Dyckia. So Hectia, just real quickly, Hectia are primarily terrestrial plants. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 species. These are the northern plants. They occur mostly in Mexico, but the range does go north up into Texas and south into Honduras. They're dioecious, which means to get good seed on these, you need a male and a female plant. And they seem to be more common in the hotter, drier places of their range. The inflorescence on the Hectia is one of the ways you can tell the inflorescence on these is lateral, which means it comes out between the leaves as opposed to coming out of the center of the plant. Flowers are not really that impressive. Generally, they're white. Sometimes you'll find them in other colors, but people don't grow these for the flowers. If you're going to grow these, they like a lot of root room, and they require good drainage. And if you stress them a little bit, you'll get some pretty amazing colors in some of them.
And not to interrupt you,
no, anytime.
The Tectias tend to be a little bit bigger than the Dyckias in general. Is that right?
In general, I would say yes, but there are some Dyckias that could get pretty large.
Yeah.
I wouldn't use the size as the way to determine which
Oh, no, no,
Which
no.
yeah,
No, we're not. No, no. I understand that.
yeah.
Dyckias are in Mexico. The Dyckias are in Brazil. That's pretty much
Hmm.
the rule. Okay, go ahead. I'm
Yeah.
sorry I interrupted.
No, it's okay. The Deuteroconia is a really interesting group of plants. They're both found as terrestrials and they grow on rocks. And again, these numbers are constantly changing, but when I put this presentation together, there are roughly 17 recognized species. And these are plants of the Andes mostly, the eastern slope of the Andes, and their range goes down into Bolivia and Argentina, and into the lowlands of western Brazil and some of the other adjoining countries. Part of their range does overlap with Dickia. And there's essentially two different forms. There's the large rosette, which this Deuteroconia longipetala, which is this picture here, is an example of that. But there's also clumping forms, which I'll get into here in just a minute. But these are generally plants of arid rocky habitat. Uh, the inflorescence on these plants comes out of the center of the rosette as opposed to in between the leaves on the plant. So that's one characteristics that allows you to determine the difference. The other thing that's different about these plants is the inflorescence is perennial, which means the plant will send out a flower stalk, it'll bloom, the flowers will die, but rather than drying out and blowing away, the inflorescence stays on the plant and it will continue to bloom year after year. So if you're going to grow these plants, you may want to just leave the inflorescence in place and let it do what it does. The flowers are.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I don't mean to interrupt again. The other thing is to note about smaller deuteroconias is for 30 or 40 years, as near as I remember, they were put in the genus, put Abromatelia.
Yeah.
Ablometelia, then you sort of got knocked out. It's these games that the botanists play, and we sort of have to toe the line. But these are all the small deuteroconias are very small compared to the rest of the deuteroconias.
Yeah, and to go along with what Barry just said, again, here we go. And the names continue to change. When I put this presentation together, these are the clumping, some of the examples of the clumping forms or mat type deuteroconias. The top one, brevifolia, Deuteroconia brevifolia, is probably one of the more sought after. It's got a really small, tight grouping and makes it a really attractive plant. The one on the bottom, Deuteroconia lorenziana, is the green form of that plant. That actually has been placed into the brevifolia species, so that's changed. And the abstrusa, the gray form, was the gray form of Deuteroconia lorenziana. So between the clumpers and the splitters, it all becomes very difficult to stay on top of. But these are great plants. And the picture on the left is an example of using these Deuteroconia brevifolia in your gardens. This is a installation that was done by Matt Maggio at the the Sherman Library and Gardens.
Beautiful.
Of course, Dyckias are probably the more distant looking from the Dyckias in the plants that we're talking about here. If you've ever been to the Huntington Botanical Garden and looked at their Dyckia collection, these things become massive and take over entire beds of plantings. So probably not the best plant for a lot of home growers. But these are the plants of the Andes. There's over 200 species, really hardy plants. Because of the high elevation, they can take real low temperatures if kept dry. Some of them are monocarpic, which means once the individual rosette flowers, then that head will actually die. The largest of all the bromeliads is Puya ramonde, which the actual plant grows up to 9 feet tall with a 30-foot inflorescence on it or flower stalk. And as you can see, these are high elevation plants.
It's got
When I was doing,
Queen of the Andes
yeah, yes,
poison Monday. It's spectacular, and
it
it
is.
grows certain very altitudes, and it grows completely alone. There's only just like scrub plants below it.
Yeah, very, very impressive plants. When I was doing the research for this presentation, I came across this term protocarnivorous, and it kind of piqued my interest. So I did a little bit of research, and there's a Puya chilensis, which is a protocarnivorous plant. For a plant to actually be carnivorous, it has to have four characteristics. It has to be able to attract prey, it has to be able to capture prey, it has to be able to digest prey, and it has to benefit from the nutrients. This particular plant doesn't meet all those characteristics, but what it does do, because the way the marginal teeth on the rosettes are formed, when small rodents or birds get into the center of this plant, they're unable to escape. Eventually, they perish. And over time, the bodies desiccate, and of course, it gets washed down into the soil. So, yes, they're able to capture prey, and yes, they're able to benefit from the nutrients. I don't think it meets the other two criteria.
It's
but
interesting.
Apparently,
I'm sorry, interesting to bring that up. What people might know or not know, and they can't see in the photos, is most of the puyas have very sharp, almost fish hook type thorns or spikes on the edges of the leaves. So it can be very easy for a small animal to get in, but once they're moving, trying to get out, these thorns will hook into their feathers or their flesh and hold them there till they starve and die.
Yeah. Apparently, there are several plants in South Africa that have the same characteristic. In talking to a friend who's kind of an expert on Namibia, but yeah. I just thought that was kind of interesting and
very interesting.
The common name, a common name in where these things grow is a sheep killer, and there's stories of sheep getting caught in these, and how much of that is scientific fact and how much of it is just rumor. I don't know, but I just thought that was something interesting.
I've heard of that too from the sheep herders in the Andes.
Yeah. This is an example of the monocarpic growth. If you look at the two, if you can see the photograph, if you look at the two rosettes on the right, they're fully leafed out. The one just above, behind the second one on the right, you can see where it's lost its leaves, but it still has the inflorescence. And this is hard to do without my laser pointer. I'm used to using a laser pointer. But then those three bottom heads on the bottom, you can see that they've lost their leaves and the rosettes. So that's an example of what we mean when we talk about a monocarpic growth. And of course, what puyas are really known for are the spectacular flowers. This is just a very small example of how amazing some of these flowers can be. Encolarium is an interesting genus of plants. I have no experience growing these. I haven't been able to get a hold of any of them here in Southern California where I live. These are endemic to Brazil, more closely found on the eastern coast. And these are the most closely related of these plants to Dyckias. At the time that I did this research, there were 27 recognized species. And I just happened to have seen a presentation put on by Dylan Zoller, who's a curator at the Sherman Garden, who's done a lot of field work with these plants. And they're finding more and more species on a regular basis. Interesting enough, a lot of these plants are pollinated by bats. And what I learned from Dylan was these plants, the inflorescence comes out of the center of the rosette. And there's somebody doing some work on these plants and talking about clumpers and splitters. He's suggesting that they put these plants into the same genus as Dyckia, which would be really interesting because of the way the inflorescence displays itself. We'll see what happens there.
I think they're going to find there's a DNA difference but they are intimately grouped into the same habitats as a lot of the Dyckias in Brazil.
Yeah, if you look at the evolution of these plants, the Encolariums and the Dyckias were separated not too long ago, very closely related.
Yeah. And
Um,
it's also just this, it's just amazing. It's just a complete mystery why these genera are separated and or close to each other, meaning, Hectias look a fair amount like the rest of the terrestrials, but they're up in Mexico. And
yeah,
the Dyckias are down in Brazil. It's whatever the mystery is, they're marvelous plants to grow in a landscape or as a collector. Okay, go ahead, continue. I'm sorry.
um, because Encolariums, to my experience, are not very commonly seen. My friend Niels Christensen has actually been to South America to see these plants in habitat, and he was kind enough to share some of his photos with me. So just to kind of give you an example of what some of these plants look like, Niels allowed me to share some of these photos with you. So here's some more. Unfortunately, we don't have species names on them, but this
Beautiful.
is yeah, very very interesting group of plants.
One more thing I wanted. I'm sorry to keep cutting in, but one
That's
thing I
fine.
want the audience to know is that many of these plants, the Encolariums and the Dyckias, grow in riparian habitats. So they're high granitiferous plains or outcroppings of rocks where puddles of water and or groundwater will well up and they'll grow close to some of these water sources. But let me tell you this, these plants grow in a place where you as a human, without a steady supply of fresh water and a good backpack full of food, you'd be dead in one day. I'm not kidding. It's hotter than hell. It's humid. Most of these places are very humid. Some aren't. But these are the most incredible survivors, both Encolariums, Dyckias, Deuteroconias. We think of them as something that will grow great in our Southern California or in Southern Florida. But just like many bromeliads, these plants are ultimate survivors. And you just have to understand that their habitats they come from are very, very inhospitable to human life. And yet these plants make their living there. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to get into that a little bit
Oh,
here.
okay. I'm sorry.
That's fine. It's all good. Of course, and then Dyckia. Dyckias are the plants of Brazil, although the range does go into Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The Encolariums, like I said, are Brazilian endemics. They're found mostly on the Atlantic coast. And of course, the Deuteroconias are the plants of the eastern slopes of the Andes, and their range goes into Argentina and Bolivia, so there's overlap there. And of course, the Encolariums and Dyckias grow together as well. Interesting enough, this plant that I have this picture of, this is a plant that I believe was found by a man by the name of Constantino that lives down in South America. And when he found it, he just gave it the name Dyckia magnifica, which was not a scientific name. That's just what he called it. And the plant since then has been described and now is recognized scientifically as Dyckia magnifica. And it is a beautiful plant. This is one of my plants here in this photograph.
Stunning.
So getting back to Dyckias, many species are quite rare. They're difficult to identify. And I put a little note to myself that says, like Dudleya. A friend of mine and I spent about 5 years kind of exploring the Santa Monica and the San Gabriel Mountains in an effort to try to understand our local Dudleya population. And, you get kind of excited about a project and you say, okay, we're going to find the location of these plants. We're going to go out and find them and we're going to photograph them and it's going to be really neat. So it sounds pretty easy. But once you start getting out there in the field and you start seeing these plants, you realize that a lot of different species look very similar. A lot of different species grow in close proximity to each other. Um, there's a lot of natural hybridization that goes on. Sometimes this natural hybridization causes some hybrid swarms. And then with that, you have to imagine that these hybrids and these hybrid swarms are back crossing with the different species. So all of a sudden you realize this is not an easy thing to figure out. And, lay people like my friend Nils and I, we don't have access to doing, DNA studies and all that kind of stuff. We just look at the characteristics of the plant, and it becomes a very difficult thing to do. And in my reading, that it seems like that same situation is occurring with the Dyckias. And there's it's not that easy unless you have the facilities to be able to really explore the genetics of the plant. And just for the record, Dyckia is not the correct pronunciation. It's Dyckia, but I've been calling him Dyckias for so long, it's imprinted in my brain, and I apologize for that.
I'm guilty of it too.
But the Dyckias, the flowers on them are usually orange. The ones that are more to the western range seems to be more yellow in color, and sometimes they'll have a really deep orange color, which goes almost into a red. Like I said earlier, they have the lateral inflorescence, which means the flower stalk comes out from in between the leaves. These are pollinated mostly by hummingbirds and other flying insects. The seeds are wind dispersed, and I'll get into that a little bit more here in a little bit. And what I noticed in my plants, and again, I'm not a horticulturist or a botanist. I'm just a guy that likes to grow these plants. But what I see is that the flowers on these plants will sometimes create these little nectar balls, and the ants seem to really like it. And I think what I believe is that ants are not pollinators of these plants, but I think it's some kind of a symbiotic relationship where the flowers produce this nectar for the ants, and the ants probably help protect these plants from other harmful insects. I don't have anything to prove, but that's kind of what I suspect.
I think it's a very valid observation. Experience as a collector and as a grower sometimes can exceed what the botanists know. But that's not to put botanists down. I have a botanical background, scientific background myself. But I have found that very often longtime collectors like yourself will make observations that even the field biologists don't know. So everyone has a role to play in preserving these plants and finding interest in them and passing this knowledge on to the next generation. Go ahead.
Okay.
Wow.
Another thing that I found was kind of interesting, and kind of going back to what Barry was saying, is that there's essentially three habitats that these plants grow in. Basically, they mostly grow in summer rainfall areas, but you'll find them growing on these dry inselbergs, which are kind of rocky outcrops, cliffs, and slopes, and really in soil that's really poor in nutrients, and of course, very little water supply. You'll also find them growing along the coast in sandy soils. And what I found really interesting, there are also some of these Dyckias that are considered rheophytic. And what that means is that these plants will grow in these deep canyons. And during the rainy season, these canyons will flood. So these plants, for long periods of time, will be submerged underwater. And they have adapted to be able to survive in those environments. And from my understanding, there's about 12 species that do this. Two of the ones that I've been able to collect is brevifolia, which is what this photograph is here. And then there's a larger plant. I always have a problem with this word, Dyckias, which is a much larger plant, much larger rosette than the brevifolia here in the photograph.
What's interesting too is just on that note, this ability to have this very fleshy tissue and to swell enormously, both the root mass and the internal part of the plant in relation to this, these extreme flooding that might go on for a couple of weeks and then for most of the rest of the year, there's nothing. So it's a very interesting survival adaptation. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I found that quite interesting, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later when I get to in a couple slides here. So, just rough, I'm going to go through some of the species that I've been able to collect over the years, and just a very brief comment on each of them. BDA, Dyckia BDA is a lovely plant. It has kind of this almost lavender color leaf with these cream colored marginal spines on it. This is a plant of west central Brazil.
Beautiful.
This is the Dyckia brevifolia that we are just talking about. And what I got this plant from that collection that I first talked about at the beginning of this presentation. And for the longest period of time, it didn't look very good. And once I understood where it grew, I started keeping the pot in a pan of water. So when I watered it, it would have access to water for a longer period of time. And that seemed to make a big difference. And the plant still, 12 years later, looks good and is doing just fine.
When they're dry, they look really.
Yeah. Dyckia Corstamenia is one of the very small Dyckias. These rosettes are tiny, 4.5 inches. Very grassy looking plant. I've gotten some really interesting hybrids by crossing this with other compound Dyckias. I'll show you an example here in a little bit. Dyckia dawsoni is a beautiful Dyckia. You can what makes this plant a little bit different. It's got these thin, kind of strappy leaves, and the marginal teeth are quite separated compared to a lot of the other plants. This is a really nice plant to collect and grow.
It's been around in the trade or in collectors' possessions for quite a while. Lyman B. Smith was one of the first people to identify this. So the plant goes back in cultivation for collectors like 70, 80 years.
Oh, wow.
Some of these other Dyckias, some of the other Dyckias are more like they've been in collections for 40, 50 years. Up here, I don't mean down there.
Yeah. Yeah, this to my aesthetic, this is a pretty impressive plant.
Very impressive.
Another really nice plant is Dyckia delicata. This is one that I'm establishing in my backyard garden. And this is a plant of southern Brazil. And Distica, this is the one that I was talking about earlier. That's a rarephytic plant. And I guess because of the building of dams in the area where this plant grows, it's almost extinct in the wild. And apparently there's only one natural population that exists. So hopefully they can keep it going. We'd hate to see this disappear. It's a really cool plant.
We humans are experts at destroying things.
Yes, we are. Another really interesting plant is Dyckia estevaceae. And this plant is interesting because of its growth pattern. It has this distichous growth where the leaves come out like a fan. If you're any aloe folks out there, Aloe plicatilis is another one that has this kind of growth pattern. This is a fairly large plant, and what I found, this was gifted to me by a friend, and in transporting it, these leaves are very, very brittle. So if you're going to grow this plant, you want to put it where people aren't going to be bumping into it and stuff, because the leaves will just break right off. You can see on the left-hand side where those leaves have broken off. But just because of the growth pattern, this one is pretty unique. And of course, Floribunda is a fairly common one. The picture on the left is kind of the normal growth. The one on the right is a form that was introduced by the Huntington Botanical Garden through their ISI program. You can see the difference. It has this really nice gray color to it. It's really quite a lovely plant. A pretty good size too. It's 1.5 foot or so in diameter. And one of the things that I find very interesting is the variation you'll get within a species. And we saw this for sure when we were looking at our local Dudleya. but these are both examples of Dickia fosteriana. And you can see the one on the left has more of a darker leaf color, and the leaves are a little bit whiter. The one on the right, the leaves are much thinner, and it has more of this white scurfing on the leaves. Gives it quite a bit of a different look. You know, somebody with that doesn't have a lot of experience looking at these plants might think that these are totally different plants, but they're not. They're both Dickia fosteriana.
Well, that's with all plants in scientific botany. It's written the floral characteristics, the way the spike or the inflorescence is formed and morphology of that, as well as the morphology of the specific parts of the flowers, is what we use to determine a name and a specific identity. But it is amazing. This is one of the funnest parts of bromeliads, all bromeliads, but especially the Dyckias and the other terrestrials, is that you will have different forms, and they're very clearly nice and beautiful, each in their own form. So it's fun to have these different things to collect. Go ahead.
Yeah, you know, and to go along with what you just said is, you know, sometimes someone somewhere found a plant and collected it, brought it into cultivation and propagated it. So, you know, people all over the world grow this plant and they think they know what this plant looks like, but that's only, you know, a couple examples of a huge range of plants in habitat. So,
right. And even a given population,
exactly.
From the Gyre Angelo Plateau that comes over to a riparian edge, there may have been different pollinators, different influences, and yet you will be in the same genus and same species.
Yeah, yeah. This is one of my favorites. This is Dyckia hebdingii, and this is another plant. I've got a couple of these established in my backyard garden, and this is the blue form. Beautiful. It's really a cool plant. Not too big. It's probably, you know, 8 inches in diameter. I just looked this morning and I got looks like I might get seed pods on both those plants. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Hopefully I can get some good seed from them this year. And then this is Dyckia jonesiana in terrible need of being repotted. This plant is a little bit unique in that it spreads through stolons, which is not, in my experience, a common characteristic of Dyckias. And then I was talking a little bit about these hybrid swarms. This plant here, Dyckia julianae, genetic studies of this plant shows that it's very closely related to Dyckia chloristomenia, that little tiny grassy looking one, and Dyckia hebdingii, which is the one that I just showed. And it's kind of in between those plants in size, and it kind of has a similar look to the two of them. I suspect that maybe it's possible that, you know, way back, you know, eons ago, this may have been a hybrid swarm that stabilized and today is a species. Again, I have no way of proving that. It's just kind of from what I read and what I kind of think. Well, and again, I don't claim to be an expert by any means.
No. But all your observations are so spot on. You know, part of the problem is, as with many things in this world, there just isn't proper funding to do the science that we need to understand more about bromeliads. It'll happen in the future, but, you know, obviously starving people is a bigger issue than bromeliad science. But for me, having collected and grown bromeliads for well over 55 years now, started when I was 10 years old, these are mysteries that, you know, I literally think about this stuff in my sleep. That's how much it bothers me. It's an issue that's a mystery, and I like to solve mysteries. But I see what you're saying, that this does look like both parents, or might be like both parents.
Yeah, so it's another lovely plant, very, very nice plant. And of course, you know, one of the stars of the genus is Marne Las Pastole, variation Marne Las Pastole. And again, looking at the variation within a species, the one on the left is a much larger rosette, The marginal teeth are much more aggressive. They're larger. The one on the right, it's got these leaf patterns in the leaf, and it's just a smaller plant and just a little. I don't know if calm is the right word, but it's not as aggressive looking as the one on the left.
These have fairly thick, fleshy leaves, right?
Yes, yeah, and I'm going to get into that here in a little bit.
Oh,
Um,
I gotta keep doing it to you. Sorry.
um, and there's another variation, and I apologize. The condition of these plants is not great, but these are amazing plants. This is Martinez estevesii, and the one on the left is an example of one that was distributed by the Huntington Botanical Gardens ISI program, and the one on the right is one that I got from Brian Chan. And the one on the right, particularly, when it's in its true best form, the skirting is just so bright white. It's really an amazing plant. I apologize for the quality of
No,
these photos here.
they're beautiful.
Another interesting plant is platyphylla, Dyckia platyphylla. Apparently, this plant was discovered in a greenhouse somewhere down in South America. It was described as the species Dyckia platyphylla, but as far as I know, to date, they've never been able to find a location of where this plant comes from. So the controversy is it really a species, or is it some greenhouse hybrid? As far as I know, that they still don't know the answer to that. And then Pogonensis is another one that you can see. This is a little bit different. The leaves on the rosette are very sparse. This is a fairly large plant, probably this. And these sizes I'm giving you are the size of my plant. I don't know what they are in habitat, but this is probably 14-inch rosettes. And again, you can see on the picture on the right, this is also a stoloniferous plant. This one's from Bolivia. And Dyckia rariflora is one of the smaller grassy looking plants. Not too impressive, but they'll clump. They'll make nice little clumps. And a very similar looking plant is Dyckia remotaflora, and this is another Huntington ISI plant. Unless you see this one and the previous one side by side, sometimes it's hard to distinguish the difference between the two. They both have yellow flowers. And then Dyckia richardi, I haven't been able to find a lot of information about this plant, but just looking at the plant and growing it, it seems to me that this may be another one of those rariphytic plants. The look is very similar to brevifolia and distica. And the last one here is Velascana. This is a pretty large plant. I wouldn't call it a beautiful plant, but it's large. It's pretty interesting. Nasty spines.
Yeah. But it's funny. Just a note on that, on the aesthetics. When I first got into this when I was a kid, the first plant I got was a Macmea fasciata. Of course, there was nothing available. But my plant mentor, my Vermilion mentor, whose name was Frenchie, that's a local friendly name. His real name was R.M. Delgado. He was actually one of the founding fathers of the entire Vermilion Society. But my first contact with Dyckias was through Frenchie, and also, for instance, Twinsia zerographica. Anyways, the point is early on, I didn't really have much of an impetus to collect the Dyckias. Over time, they became more beautiful to me. Now, what I used to think was ugly, I find incredibly beautiful. So even the strangest, least interesting bromeliads, as I've aged, have become very beautiful to me. Maybe that's because I'm hearing the fluttering of the angel of death. No, but it's interesting. It's interesting that what we as humans consider aesthetically beautiful is only one aspect for instance, one way that a plant like this might be beautiful is what I brought up before, the intimate high survivability in biomes and in habitats that are so intensely difficult to live in. So there's different kinds of beauty. I'm not trying to tell anyone how to live their lives, but I found there's a certain beauty to survivability. Go ahead.
It doesn't have to be beautiful to be interesting.
There you go. Thank you. He puts it in 6 words when I spit 25 words.
Okay.
Wow.
I had I was very fortunate to be able to be a volunteer at the Huntington Botanical Garden, and I got to work with Karen Zimmerman, who is probably most noted for her aloe hybrids. So to see her working with her aloes and to kind of understand, what she was trying to accomplish through her cross-pollinating and all that stuff, she was she took really close notes, and she really was into this and put a lot of energy into it.
She's considered like aloe royalty in the circles.
But seeing her do that and seeing her plants and the ones that she selected to, go into tissue culture and all that stuff was really fascinating to me. And I kind of tinkered around with aloe hybrids for a while. Then when I got into the Dyckias and joined the San Fernando Club, I thought, I'd like to do the same thing with the Dyckias, and seeing what Bill Baker and some of the other people I'm going to talk about here, what they were doing, really got me excited about experimenting with that. So that's kind of where we're going to go next. And one of the things I learned from Karen and Tim Harvey, who's was another aloe hybridizer, is that when you're growing these plants, when they're about 2 or 3 years old, they'll look one way and you might think, wow, this is something really special, but they're not done growing. And as years go on, they're going to change and they're not going to keep those same characteristics as that 3-year-old plant. And this plant on the left showed up in one of my flats, and I thought, oh man, this is as good as it gets. And a couple of years later, it looked like the one on the right, which is the same plant. If you look at the patterns, you'll see. And now that plant has totally lost its variegation. It's just another green Dyckia. So you can't get too excited about where a plant's going until it's fully mature.
No, but part of the mystery and the allure of hybridizing is chasing the characteristics. You may not win, you may not end up with something, but occasionally you end up with something stable that's amazing, and you change the way bromeliad collectors will collect plants forever.
Yeah, and I'm going to show you some examples of that.
It's a laudable thing you're trying to do.
Yeah, but before we do that, you can't really talk about Dyckia hybrids without talking about Bill Baker, and just a really quick overview. And this is some information I got from interviewing a very close friend of Bill's, Steve Ball. And essentially, the way this thing started with the Dyckias is in 1984, Bill was at Ed Hummel's nursery, and there was a plant sitting underneath one of the benches that caught Bill's eye. And it was probably, from the way it's described, probably a hybrid of Fosteriana, which is that smaller, really contrasty dark and dark leaves with light colored marginal teeth. This is not that plant, but this will kind of give you an idea of sort of what it might have looked like. Not quite this intense. So he took that plant, and because it was 1984 when the Olympics were here in Los Angeles, he called it Olympia. Was the name of the plant. So he took that plant and he crossed it with Platyphylla. Platyphylla was that large green one with the really wide leaves on it that I showed you earlier. And when he sowed the seed and germinated the seeds from that plant, he got a plant that he called Toothy. So Toothy was a cross between this probably Fosteriana hybrid and Platyphylla. So then he took that plant, Toothy, and crossed it with Dawsoni. Dawsoni was that one that we really looked at, the one we looked at earlier, the dark kind of a burgundy with the white marginal teeth on it. And he came up with this Grex of plants that are some of his probably most sought after plants. And that would include Brittle Star, Morning Star, Arizona, and another plant called Winter's Edge. These are all extremely, today, desirable Bill Baker hybrids. You don't see them too often. Brittle Star is probably the most sought after. The reason being that it, as far as I know, it does not offset, and it's very slow to bifurcate for the heads to split, and it's not easy to propagate, unless they get into tissue. Oh yeah. So unless you get into tissue culture, you're not going to be able to replicate it with any large numbers. And Bill was also known, he'd gone into Mexico and South America and did some collecting, which we don't do today. But some of the plants that he collected in Mexico were the Tillandsias, and he got some really nice Dyckias down in South America, both Marna Las Pastoli, the species Marna Las Pastoli and Estevesii. And unfortunately, Bill passed away at way too young of an age in 2009. So just to review that, the upper left is probably something with that original Olympia looked like. Cross it with Platyphylla, the green one on the right. The seedlings of those two plants he crossed with Dawsoni, which is the bottom left. And that's where Brittle Star and all those other plants that I mentioned came from. And Marna Las Pastoli is another plant that he actually collected in South America, and he infused that into his hybrid program. And I'll show you some of his more notable hybrids, some examples. One on the left is Heaven and Hell. It's my understanding that this is used a lot as a point of departure for a lot of the hybrids that come out of Thailand. South Bay, the one on the right, is another one of his well-known hybrids. Bill Palin is a great plant. The one on the right, Zebra, I got this plant from a friend, and this is one that you really don't see too often. I don't know if it's that well recognized as a Bill Baker hybrid. And
just
of course, Isaac.
One second, just so the audience knows, that last hybrid, Bill Palin, is named after, he was a absolutely amazing, super friendly. He was a local botanist, landscaper, heavily supported the Vermilion Society. He was an old friend of mine, and so was Bill Baker. But Bill Palin did everything he did was to support the local plant societies. He was amazing. Go ahead.
Yeah, unfortunately, I came on too late to get to know any of those guys.
Okay, I thought I'd fill in something for the audience.
The one on the right is a really nice plant. It's called Tarzan. And if you're going to find Bill Baker hybrids, true Bill Baker hybrids, this is probably the one you're most likely to find because it's quite a heavy offsetter. It's very easy to propagate. So this is one you may come across. And then Son of Tarzan, which looks nothing like Tarzan, is a beautiful plant.
Probably, and then probably crossed that stevia, right? Who knows?
Yeah, Marna Las Pastoli maybe with all that skirting.
Marna Las Pastoli, right.
And of course, that very first plant that I talked about in the beginning of this presentation is Irwin. That's the first plant that I ever got. It's hybrid Irwin. And then, of course, the holy grail of hybrid Bill Baker hybrids is Brittle Star.
This currently in Southeast Asia, a mature plant, I just heard of one, it went for $2,000.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
The pups are 500 or whatever, but a mature, really beautiful plant, $2,000.
Yeah, this plant is very difficult to propagate. This plant was gifted to me at that size from a friend in Tucson, and he sent one to me, and he sent one to another friend up in the Central Coast. And by the time it got to me, it was pretty desiccated. And unfortunately, my friend up north, the one that he got, didn't survive. This plant took almost a full year to recover from being bare rooted and repotted. So that's probably one of the reasons why they're not, unless you're tissue culturing them.
Yeah, no, they're very, very slow.
Yeah, yeah. But so that's brittle star. So another friend, Brian Chan, is doing some amazing stuff with his hybrids. He did back in the late '90s. He did a series called the Bear series, and he's got Dancing Bear and Mama Bear and Polar Bear and all these different bears. This is Dancing Bear. This is one of his hybrids, and he used Morning Star as his point of departure for this series, and that was one of those ones that came from that Bill Baker Grex of plants. And then another one of Brian's plants, White Whiskers, and he used Morning Star again as the seed parent for this. And he uses a number and letter to track his plants. And this one used Dawson Eye as the seed parent. And you can see the Dawson Eye influence because of those really thin leaves and how far apart the marginal teeth are. But Brian does some really nice plants.
Looks a
And these
looks a little bit like Guarini, but I see
Yeah.
what you mean, but much more like Dawson. But
Yeah, and I'm not real clear on these plants. These may have been seedlings that Brian got from Donna Baker after he passed away. I'm
Right.
not really sure because he says these are not his hybrids, but he provided me with these photographs. But
Yeah.
these are pretty amazing plants.
Just
And
to
then another
interject, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Just to interject, the audience can find a pretty significantly good video of the open public sale by Bill Baker's wife. This is going back about 8 years ago on my YouTube channel. I did a pretty good video of the whole collection on the day it was being sold off, but I was able to document a fair amount of what was left over by Bill after his passing
Nice.
away. It's just look up Barry Landau is my channel, and then you have to scroll way down. I have a couple hundred videos there, or you could just search for the Bill Baker collection. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
This is a plant that there's a little confusion over. It's Dyckia Keswick, and I think most people attribute this to being a Bill Baker hybrid, but actually it's not. This plant was produced by Steve Ball, and I think where the confusion lies is Steve grew this plant and then gave it to Bill Baker to propagate and distribute. So I think that's where that confusion came from. But this is actually a Steve Ball plant. And then of course, with seeing all that these guys were doing and seeing what Karen Zimmerman was doing with the aloes, I got a little bit excited about trying to do some of this stuff myself. So these are some of my plants. These are the first generation plants. The one on the left I call Chainsaw. And these are all, what I'm doing is I'm crossing complex hybrids with complex hybrids. So, tracking what the parent is really doesn't tell you much. So I don't really worry about that too much. The one on the right I call Dragon Spine just because of the shape of the marginal teeth on it. And a couple more, Somos Lights. Steve Ball actually suggested the name for that one.
Beautiful.
And Moon Dust is another a little bit smaller rosette. And second generation, this one I'm really kind of excited about. What I use Toothy as the seed parent. And what I like about this is just the really high contrast between the leaves and the marginal teeth, and the rosettes are small. These are like just
And
a little bit over 4.
Beautiful growth habit.
Yeah, the small 4-inch heads make it a pretty attractive plant.
Beautiful.
And this is a Marna Las Pastole hybrid, not in the greatest condition, but it's a very large plant. When it was 8 inches, it was pretty small, pretty immature.
I like it. I like the curvy leaves.
Yeah, let's see. Where are we going here?
There we go.
Yeah, this is one of my second generation. This is what I call Snow Day. It's the white color on the flower just
Beautiful.
really reflects the light nicely. It's very, very happy with this one. And
It's a
then my
beautiful
favorite, of
silhouette.
course,
Beautiful
yeah,
silhouette too.
and this is my favorite of all my hybrids so far. This is what I call Angel's Flight, which
Wow.
obviously has a lot of Marner Laspastoli influence in it. And Deuterconias and Dyckias do cross. I don't cross them purposely, but I'll find plants within a seed batch that are bigeneric, and you can tell by the one on the left. Look at the inflorescence; it's coming out of the middle of the rosette, which is a key to it being a Deuterconia as opposed to a Dyckia. Of course, I don't know what I'm going to do when they add Enclariums into the Dyckia genus, but yeah, you get some interesting hybrids out of these. And then this is one that's available commercially. This, I believe, came from Michael's Bromeliads, or one of those places down in Florida, 4th of July. Looks to me like it might have been crossed with, brevifolia or one of the clumping type Deuterconias with one of the Dyckias, but it's pretty fast growing. This picture kind of is bleaches it out a lot. It's much more of a burgundy color than what we're seeing here on the screen. But the fast growing, nice. It's a nice plant. I'm thinking of putting some of this in my yard and seeing what it does. So that's it for the hybrids. Let's talk about a little bit about the culture of growing these things. I live in Moore Park, and I grow most of my plants in Somas, which are both in Ventura County, and we're USDA hardiness zones 9B and 10A. So we get a lot of coastal influence, which means we get fog. And we were talking about earlier that these plants grow in areas where they have summer rainfall, and nothing happens in the winter, but they do get fog during the winter. So they do have access to moisture. And we definitely get fog here in these two areas that I grow. And I think that has a lot to do with the ease of me growing these plants. They do very well for me here in Moore Park and in Somas. So I think air circulation is a critical part to growing healthy plants. And again, there's 1,000 different ways to grow these plants, and I'm just talking about this is what I do, and this is what works for me.
But air circulation is, I found over the decades, is a key factor in all bromeliads if you want to excel at growing them. They'll
I agree.
stay in corporate and terrible conditions, but that's not if you want to optimize them. If you want to optimize them, they have to have air movement. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think especially with the epiphytic bromeliads, if you keep them too cluttered, I think you're more apt to have problems with disease and insects.
Yes.
I think the air circulation is critical. We have a system that allows us to infuse fertilizer into our water. So I use a very, very mild 20-20-20, just a regular standard fertilizer with every watering during the spring, summer, and fall. Then I don't fertilize in the wintertime. As far as growing them in pots, growing them in the ground, I do both. They don't care. They do fine both ways. If you don't pot them up every 1 or 2 years, you're going to slow the growth down. If you pot them up, they'll grow as much as you care to pot them up. As far as pests concerned, I've been growing these plants for 15 years or so. The only pest I ever see is aphids on the inflorescence, and that's usually associated with ants. As far as water, again, I water normally, and it's not perfect. I don't live where my plants are growing, but I try to water once a week. If it's going to be really hot, like it's been here lately, I may water an additional time in between during the winter, depending on the weather. I may hold back on the watering. These are tough plants. They're not too particular. They seem to do well in a lot of different conditions. I grow them under shade cloth. I grow them under plastic. I grow them in full sun in my backyard, and they don't seem to really care much. Soil, again, I don't think soil is a big deal. My soil that I use, the mix that I use, I just use equal parts of organic potting soil, perlite, and pumice. The only reason I add perlite is because it's much easier to get. Pumice is a little bit difficult to get, and the perlite kind of fills in, helps me get the amount of soil that I need. Humidity, like I said, even during the summertime, I'll go out to our growing compound, and the ground cloth will be damp from the fog. So I think that plays a lot in helping these plants grow healthy. These are these photographs are two pictures of my shade house where I grow a lot of, not all, but a lot of my Dyckias are in this under the shade cloth. And then light, like I said, I grow them in full sun. I grow them under shade cloth. I grow them under plastic. They all seem to do well, but they seem to really like the shade house. With probably, I don't know, I'm guessing 50% shade cloth, and they really thrive out there.
But it's not, people don't get the word idea. They're not house plants.
No, I
put
would
this into a living room and have it survive. It's just not possible.
unless you have 4 of them and you rotate them every couple of days.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure. Rotation is the secret to all indoor plants. But I'm just trying to get people to understand that if you become interested in these plants, you need to be somewhere where there's bright light and good air movement. I mean, you can even grow them in Minnesota. You better have a good greenhouse.
Yeah.
These plants don't want to go under 40 degrees or even under 45.
Yeah.
So
we've had days, we've had nights where we get a couple hours of below freezing, but it's not for long periods of time.
Yeah, they'll take an occasional hard freeze.
Yeah,
but
and because we back up to a avocado orchard, when the weather gets real cold, you turn on those agricultural fans, which moves the air. So I think that helps us a lot also.
Yep.
Something I neglected to say in the beginning of this presentation is that these Dyckias, deuteraconias, and the Anthuriums, they're not succulents in the true sense of the word. They're succulent plants, but they don't have those cells that are designed to preserve water. But they do have succulent type leaves, and they are cam plants, which means they do their gas exchange at night and their pores close down during the daytime. So they use strategies very similar to most xeric cactus and succulents. And
the word succulent describes a very large range of metabolic tricks that different plants play to survive where they are. So, and it's not it's a descriptor. It's not a word like cactus. Cactus is derived from Cactaceae. So there's an actual genera name, a genus name that it's derived from, that the common word is from. But with succulents, there is no Succulentaceae. It's so, I mean, you can even say that African violet is a form of a succulent. No, it doesn't grow in desert areas, but it grows in high tropical areas and retains a lot of moisture in itself. So well, people can study this stuff on their own. But I love your greenhouse.
But because of that, these plants fit really well in the cactus and succulent landscapes and collections. They take very similar. They may want a little bit more organic material in the potting mix and maybe a little bit more water, but they really do fit well into the xeric collections.
And they look so good with other things that the succulent cactus people collect.
Yeah, exactly. And so, getting back to the culture, when because the way these plants are designed, um, when they're in habitat and they get rained on or they get accumulation of fog, especially the ones with the recurved leaves, all that moisture is going to fall to the leaves and it's going to fall to the ground and it's going to provide water for the roots and stuff. And the other thing that happens is that, like most rosette plants, as they get new growth, the old growth dies. And you get a big accumulation of all these dead leaves in between the rosettes. Those are called remnants. And in habitat, that's a good thing because when the plant gets a lot of moisture, those remnants will act, or those dry leaves will act like a sponge and they'll collect moisture and save moisture. So the plant has more access to moisture for a longer period of time. And as those old leaves die and desiccate and get washed into the soil, they provide nutrients for the plant. But in cultivation, we don't care about that because we water our plants and we groom our plants. So when a plant is overgrown, like this one on the left, and if you just water it overhead, there's a good chance that that plant's not getting enough water because all that water, the leaves are moving it away from the pot. So you have to be real careful that when you water these plants, you're actually watering them. If you've got 3 plants, you can just sit them in a bucket for, 5 minutes and you're going to water them. But if you have hundreds of plants, that's not practical. Um, I've heard of people using funnels, like the big funnels that you use for changing your oil in your car, using those to get the water in there, or you can just be real careful to make sure you get the water underneath. But that's not practical if you have a lot of plants. So the way I solve that problem is I trim the plants up. I trim off all the dead leaves. And what that does is not only, first of all, I think it makes the plant look a lot more interesting. Second of all, it allows you to easily water the plant. And third of all, it makes weeding really easy. You look at that plant on the left and imagine, there's a bunch of weeds on the topsoil of that plant, and you got to get in there with your tweezers to try to get all those weeds off. It's too time consuming. By grooming your plants, and I'm going to show you some examples here in a minute, it just makes the maintenance much more easier, and it definitely, in my aesthetic opinion, makes them look more interesting. So on the left is an example of a plant that has been badly neglected in need of some TLC. So with a little time and effort, that plant on the right is the same plant 45 minutes later. So you can see how much easier that plant on the right would be to take care of.
Dramatic.
And to maintain it, to trim off the dead leaves every 6 to 12 months is all it takes. And I've discussed this in other presentations, and I've been asked to be a little bit more descriptive of how I do that. So this is that. This is a Platyphylla hybrid. You can see it has all these dead leaves. So the first step is you have to decide, okay, where am I going to start? Where am I going to attack this plant so I can start getting to all those dead leaves? So it's kind of hard to see, but if you see the picture on the left, you can see my scissors, the silver scissors. And like I said, this is hard to do without my laser pointer, but I'm going to cut off that large leaf there in the lower left-hand corner. That's going to be my first step. And then I'm going to work my way around the rosette until it looks like the one on the right. That's the same rosette on the right. Now, and then of course you continue that with all the plants. Now, sometimes if you look at the picture on the left, you'll get these offsets that are low on the plant. So, it's whatever you want. You can decide to leave that offset there and let it grow. I think the plant would be more interesting if you removed it. So if I just took my scissors and cut that plant off, the base of that small rosette is still there, and it's going to come back and it's going to grow. But if I grab that rosette with my thumb and kind of roll it off, you'll see on the picture on the right, you'll see like a little dimple in the stem of the plant. Now that offset has been completely removed, and it will not grow back.
Now, let me ask you a question. Do you use any sulfur or cinnamon? What do you do about open tissue? Does it dry out quickly enough?
Yeah, I don't do anything. I've never had a problem with rot or anything like that.
Okay.
And I do this a lot.
Yeah.
So here's kind of a before and after. Let's see if this works. Try to do a little video here. There we go. So this is what it looked like in the beginning, and the plant on the left is the same plant after it's been trimmed up.
Yeah.
So you can see how it's just easier to deal with once you've done this.
Well, and then also that was just groomed. In 6 months or a year, this just groomed plant is going to look a lot better and won't look so cut up.
If you think of it like a bonsai, the first time you take your tree and you decide to trim it, it's not going to look that great. What you're doing is you're setting the plant for what it's going to look like in the future. So if you look at this is kind of the first trimming, because in time these rosettes are going to grow, these stems are going to grow, and you're going to have this almost like a big caudex, and it makes a really, really interesting plant.
How old is that clump? That's got to be like a 6, 8-year-old, 10-year-old clump?
I would say, 7 years, I'm guessing.
7 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not a flash in the pan hobby. It's a hobby of patience, but it pays off.
And at my age, I question the wisdom of me growing plants from seed.
Yeah. Well, there needs to be a plan where these are going to go. Yeah. But
so these are the tools that I find helpful in trimming these plants. You need a good pair of shears. Wow. The longer the handle, the easier it is to keep your hands away from the spines. A good pair of long tweezers is probably my biggest go-to instrument. Sometimes you can't get a good enough grip with those tweezers, so a pair of needle nose pliers could be helpful. A heavier pair of shears can be helpful. If you're going to be splitting heads, a very stiff back knife will work. This particular butter knife works well on smaller plants. With larger plants, I have a large, like a butcher knife that I use, or a bonsai saw could be a little bit easier on the plant and on you to work with. Of course, you need tags and a pencil because you have to immediately tag it, because otherwise you'll forget. And as we get older, our skin gets softer and more sensitive, so it's not a bad idea, especially when you first start doing this, to wear gloves. And the turntable, of course, is very helpful. So as far as potting up, I was asked to put one of these plants in a show about 7 years ago. So this is a Tom Glavitz pot, and this is a plant that I put in that pot. This plant is still in that pot 7 years later, and it hasn't really grown much. It's grown taller, but not bigger. So if you don't pot them up, you can keep them looking nice and you can keep them small. His brothers and sisters are now they fill 2-gallon pots. So if you pot them up consistently, they will grow. If you leave them confined, I've neglected seedlings, and I've left seedlings in a 4-inch pot for 4 years, and they don't grow hardly at all. But once you start potting them up, they will grow, and sometimes they'll grow quite rapidly. So as far as propagation, we're getting close to the end here. As far as propagation, there's basically, unless you're going to get into tissue culture, which is way above what we're talking about here, there's 3 ways to propagate, either through bifurcated heads separating, offsets, or stolons. So some of these plants offset quite a bit. Some of them don't offset hardly at all. So your only means of propagating is through separating the heads. So the one on the left, excuse me, is a rosette that's just getting ready to divide. You can see where the thing is starting to split and the heads are starting to grow separately. And over time, it's going to look like that one on the right. And the one on the right is like perfect for dividing. Now you can take it out of the pot and probably grab the base of those 2 plants, and by working back and forth with your hands, you could probably separate that one at that stage. Sometimes you need to be a little bit more aggressive, and that's where your a stiff back knife or a bonsai saw or something like that. Actually, I know one guy that is with larger plants has used a reciprocating saw to separate them.
Yeah.
Just keep in mind you want to be as kind to the roots as you possibly can. Some of these plants, like I mentioned with the brittle star, they really don't like their roots disrupted. So that's why when I trim these plants, I know I used to take them out of the pot and do it because it's so much easier. But now I find I've done it enough that I'm comfortable just doing it with the plant in place in the pot without disturbing the roots.
They do have a significant response to root trauma.
Yeah.
I noticed that too.
And some are much more sensitive and some of them don't care, but you don't know which is which, especially when you're dealing with
better to err on the side of safety, and
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, and then of course you have offsets, and here's some examples of offsets. Kind of the rule of thumb that I've always heard is you want to wait till the offset is about 2/3 the size of the parent plant. That you hear that all the time. If the offset,
yeah,
right. Now, if the offset is high on the stem and you remove it, it's probably not going to have any roots to it, and that's going to be much more difficult to root and survive. The ones that are lower on the stem, where they are actually touching the soil, a lot of those will have roots, and you're going to have much better luck with those. I just had a guy come out to my place about a month ago, and I haven't tried this, but you may want to try this. What he says is he'll take the offsets and put them in water where about the bottom third. Let me take care of that. He'll take the offset and put it in water where the bottom third of the plant is in water and leave them there over time. And he says he's had success rooting them that way. Like I said, I haven't tried it, but if you have the plants and you're experiencing that without roots, it's worth giving it a try.
But let's just say the water has to be kept fresh. You can't go in aerobic and have a bunch of bacteria in it. You'll kill them right away. But as long as it's fresh, that can work.
Yeah, you have to pay attention. You don't want the water to evaporate either.
And the other thing I've had some success with is standard rooting hormone, but you have to be very careful with rooting hormone. It's very dangerous. You can't breathe the dust at all. It'll put you in the hospital. But rooting hormone, and then in moist, dry, medium, not dry, moist, medium, and then many of the people I know will put them in a pan of water, but in some kind of growth medium with the rooting hormone, and they go pretty quick that way.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't tried that.
Yeah.
And of course, the third is, and the easiest is stolons. This is Jonesiana. The one on the left shows you an example of the stolons coming out of the root ball. And the picture on the right, this is that plant in the bottom part of the photograph is a stolon from the parent plant in the upper right. And you can see there's another one just popping up just above it next to that granite rock. This is a no-brainer. Just cut it off, put it in the soil, and it'll grow.
But once it's developed, a growth center, these very early ones on the upper part of the photo, you can't do anything with them.
Right. You got to wait till they get a little bit more mature.
Yeah.
So I grow lots of plants from seed. Again, like a lot of things in horticulture, there's a million different ways to do it. What I'm going to talk about now is what I do. First of all, I think that I'm pretty sure that Dyckias are self-pollinating. You really don't need two plants to get seed. If you're going to just leave your plants out there and you don't isolate them, you're going to have pollinators come through, and some flowers may get pollinated multiple times. And something I learned fairly recently is you can have one seed pod that is developed with pollen from different plants. So your seed batch will be, the mother plant, but the father plant could be multiple plants in a single seed batch. I didn't realize that, but that occurs. So what that means is if you're going to hand pollinate your flowers, you have to be sure that you isolate that plant before you um, take the pollen and after you take the pollen, because some bee or hummingbird could come there before you or after you, and then you're not going to get what you think you're going to get. So that's why selective pollination, you really need the resources to be able to isolate the plants and do it. I don't mess with that. What I try to do, and because I don't live where my plants grow, I'll make a decision which plants I want in the seed batch, and I'll look at the plants and everything that I don't want that pollen in that batch. I'll just cut the flower stalks off before they flower. So that way, when the bees come through, the hummingbirds come through, there's only certain plants that they're able to get the pollen from and pollinate to transfer to other flowers. It's not a perfect system, but it does give you a little bit of control over who's getting pollinated. And bottom picture is a seed pod. Basically, the seed is 3 chambers. I've never counted them, but there's probably 20 to 50 seed in each chamber. So one seed pod, you're probably going to get more seed than you ever would want plants. The picture on the left, kind of when those seed pods open, like I mentioned earlier, these are wind dispersed seed. Once it gets to this point, if you don't collect those seeds immediately, a little bit of breeze comes through and they're going to be gone, and you won't get them.
Yeah.
So there's several ways to collect seed, and I've tried over the years many of them. I've actually, picked the seed pods off and opened them by hand, and poured the seed into a little pan. I've cut the inflorescence off, stuck it in a paper bag, and let them open that way. Probably the easiest way and kind of the most natural way is you go to a paint store and they sell these nets that painters use for screening paint. And what's nice about them is they're really long. So you can put the net over your inflorescence, seal it. The seed pods will open naturally. The wind will, separate them from the seed from the inflorescence naturally. And then you just cut off the inflorescence, turn the bag upside down, pull the flower stalk off, and you've got your seed. It's very simple, doesn't take much work, and it's a very effective way to collect seed.
Very smart.
And as far as the way that I grow seed, and again, like a lot of things, lots of different ways to do it. And I'm not saying this is the best, I'm just saying this works for me. The basic tools, obviously you need seed, you need a clean container, you need soil, you need water. You definitely need plant tags and pencils, and do it immediately. Don't wait, because if you have multiple seed batches growing, you're not going to remember which one is which. And Ziploc bag. I like to use the baggie method. So what I do is these are example of 1.5-year-old seedlings. I'll take Miracle Grow, mix it half with either pumice or perlite. They both work. I like pumice better because it's heavier, and perlite has a tendency to float up to the top. It works probably just as well. I like the pumice better. Place the soil mix into a clean pot, thoroughly soak it, let it drain, sprinkle the seeds on top of your soil. Don't cover the seeds, leave them uncovered. I found that sometimes the seeds will kind of blow around a little bit, so if you mist them with a little spray bottle or something, it'll help them stick in place, so the seeds aren't going to move. Once you set them down, make out your tag, immediately stick the tag in the pot, put it in a Ziploc container, and just put it away out of direct sunlight. And in probably 2 to 6 weeks, depending on the seed and the temperature and all that stuff, you'll get seeds germinated, and in 1.5 years or so, they'll look like these here in the photograph. So just for information, this is kind of where a lot of this information that I talked about came from. And if anybody's interested in contacting me to, maybe correct some of the things that I talked about or just want to talk about the plants, this is an email address where you can get a hold of me. And Barry, I thank you so much for inviting me to share this information with your folks. And thank you very much.
Well, John, what can I say? It's a spectacular presentation, and
Thank you.
for those of us in the collector audience, we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for great guys like you with down to earth tips, and that's exactly what your presentation does. Sure, you don't cover the whole world of Dyckias. That would take us 30 hours. So this is just a beautiful introduction that gives people a reason to know why the terrestrial bromeliads are worth looking into and make a valuable hobby. And I really want to thank you for coming here today to tell us and talk to us. And, this will go on to the YouTube, on my YouTube channel.